a storm, a veteran, a German shepherd who refused to leave his side. On a night when Cleveland was frozen silent, ex-army man Thomas Miller opened his cafe to strangers and soldiers. He thought he was the one saving lives from the cold, but in truth, his loyal dog and the people who found shelter there were saving him from years of silence and loss. This is a story of loyalty, faith, and the miracles God hides in the darkest storms. If you believe in second chances, hit like, subscribe, and share which moment touched your heart the most. Snow fell like a punishment from the sky, heavy and relentless, swallowing the streets of Cleveland beneath a white, suffocating silence. Wind tore through abandoned storefronts and whipped around lampposts, howling as though the city itself was in pain. On the corner of a forgotten avenue stood Miller's Stop Cafe, a squat brick building with a flickering neon sign that fought against the darkness. Inside, Thomas Miller moved with the deliberate, practiced steps of a man who had lived too many winters, both on foreign battlefields and here, in his hometown, that had never stopped feeling like a battleground of its own. Thomas was 55 years old, his frame broad but weathered, the strength of his youth tempered by decades of scars, both visible and hidden. His face was angular, lined with furrows that deepened whenever the wind rattled the windows, as though each gust carried memories he wished he could forget. A gray beard, unevenly trimmed, clung stubbornly to his jaw, flecked with white that gave him the appearance of a soldier still on watch even long after the war had ended. His eyes, a stormy blue, carried the heaviness of someone who had buried comrades in the desert sands of Iraq and returned home to find that civilian life demanded a different kind of endurance. To strangers, he appeared stoic, gruff, perhaps even cold. But beneath that armor was a man who carried his brother's ghost in every step he took. At his side lay Ranger, a 7-year-old German shepherd whose black and tan coat was flecked with gray along the muzzle, a sign of both age and wisdom. Ranger had once been trained as a military working dog, fierce and obedient, but time had softened his sharpness into something gentler. His ears still stood erect, alert at every sound, yet his eyes held a depth of loyalty that went beyond training. It was devotion born of shared survival. He bore a faint scar along his flank, a relic of shrapnel that had torn through flesh in a desert ambush years ago. Now, in the quiet of Cleveland, Ranger carried himself like a sentinel, lying near the door with his massive head resting on his paws, waiting to defend the only man he considered family. The cafe itself was little more than a sanctuary patched together by stubbornness. The heater sputtered weakly, coughing warmth that barely held back the creeping cold. Shelves lined with old tins of coffee, dusty jars of sugar, and fading photographs gave the place an air of nostalgia. Among the photos, one frame stood out. A young man in fatigues, smiling despite the desert sun blazing overhead. That was Michael Miller, Thomas's younger brother, who had not come home from Afghanistan. His death had been the final blow that hardened Thomas's view of the world, shaping the man who now ran this humble cafe. Every decision Thomas made seemed to echo Michael's memory. The choice to keep the doors open during storms, the refusal to let strangers go hungry, the quiet conviction that no one should be left alone in the cold. Outside, the storm intensified, coating the streets in ice, pushing people into desperation. By nightfall, the cafe's neon sign became a beacon, faint but steady, promising warmth when the rest of the city seemed abandoned. The first knock came timidly, followed by the shuffling of heavy boots against the frozen sidewalk. When Thomas opened the door, the wind pushed in 2 men at once. The first was Earl Johnson, a long-haul trucker in his early 40s. He had a barrel chest and a round, weather-beaten face framed by a bushy mustache. His skin was ruddy from years behind the wheel, sun and frost carving their marks on him equally. Earl was known among other drivers for his booming laugh and generous nature. But tonight, his face was pale, and his lips trembled as he stepped inside, clutching his gloves against his chest. Behind him stumbled Caleb Turner, a 20-year-old drifter with a wiry frame, dark hair matted with snow, and hollow cheeks that told of hunger more than hardship. Caleb's eyes darted nervously, like a stray animal expecting to be turned away. He had grown up in foster homes, carrying the suspicion of someone who had never known a place to truly belong. Thomas said nothing at first, only pointed toward the small wood stove in the corner. His silence carried authority, the kind of command that did not require explanation. Earl nodded gratefully and lumbered toward the heat, while Caleb hesitated, looking at Thomas as though waiting for permission. "Sit," Thomas muttered finally, his voice gravelly, tinged with both fatigue and kindness buried deep. Caleb obeyed, folding his thin body into a chair as Ranger rose from the floor and padded over, sniffing him cautiously. The young man stiffened, but Ranger merely sat at his side, a silent acceptance that softened Caleb's suspicion. As Thomas poured steaming coffee into chipped mugs, his mind drifted. He remembered nights in Iraq when the desert wind had cut like knives, when he and his unit had huddled together against the darkness. The cafe tonight felt the same, fragile bodies gathered against a storm that showed no mercy. He placed a mug in front of Caleb, whose fingers shook as he wrapped them around the warmth. "You'll live," Thomas said flatly, but his eyes betrayed a gentler thought. "You're safe here." Hours passed, and more figures appeared out of the storm. A mother with her teenage daughter, both wrapped in thin coats not made for such weather. A pair of college students whose car had stalled on the interstate. Another trucker whose rig was buried in snowdrifts. Each arrival tested the limits of the cafe. Yet Thomas opened the door again and again, guided not by profit, but by duty. Ranger greeted each person with the same measured calm, inspecting, then settling nearby, as though to say, "You are under my protection now." Inside, the air grew heavy with human breath, the stove working overtime to push back the cold. Yet despite the discomfort, a strange sense of unity formed. People shared stories in hushed voices, Earl talking about his long routes through the Rockies, the mother speaking softly of her late husband, the students joking nervously to mask their fear. Even Caleb, who had sat in silence, began to relax under Ranger's watchful gaze, occasionally stroking the dog's coarse fur when he thought no one noticed. Thomas stood behind the counter, watching. He rarely joined the conversations, but every word seeped into him like medicine against his loneliness. He felt his brother's presence strongest in these moments, as though Michael was whispering, "Keep the light on, Tommy. Someone always needs it." And so he did, refusing payment when Earl tried to press bills into his hand, shaking his head when the mother offered her wedding ring as collateral. "Not here," Thomas said simply. "This isn't about money." By midnight, the storm was a living monster outside, screaming through alleyways, piling snow 6 feet high against the cafe walls. Inside, however, there was warmth, not enough to banish the cold entirely, but enough to remind every soul present that survival was possible. Thomas moved from table to table, refilling mugs, adjusting blankets, his body aching but his spirit steady. Ranger followed, a silent shadow, his tail brushing against chair legs, his eyes glowing in the dim light like embers. For each person who entered, Thomas felt a small victory against the storm, as though by keeping them alive, he was also keeping his brother's memory alive. When the wind slammed again against the door, Thomas looked up sharply, expecting another stranger to stumble in. Instead, he saw only darkness beyond the glass, snow swirling like a wall. He rested a hand on Ranger's head, feeling the warmth of the dog's fur against his palm. "If they're out there," he murmured quietly, "they'll find us. They always do." Ranger let out a low, affirming rumble, his chest vibrating like a distant drum. In that sound, Thomas found reassurance, not just for himself, but for everyone gathered in the fragile circle of light. And so, as Cleveland lay buried beneath the storm, Miller's Stop Cafe became more than a roadside diner. It became a haven, born not of luxury, but of resilience, kept alive by a soldier's stubbornness and a dog's unwavering loyalty. The night was long, but for the first time in years, Thomas felt that he was exactly where he was meant to be, guarding life against the cold, one soul at a time. The storm did not ease as midnight approached. Instead, it thickened, turning the streets into canyons of drifting snow, the lamps outside glowing faintly like distant lighthouses swallowed by fog. Inside Miller's Stop Cafe, warmth clung to the air in fragile layers, sustained by the groaning stove and the sheer will of Thomas Miller, who paced slowly between the clustered strangers now sheltering under his roof. Ranger, ever alert, patrolled the room in quiet arcs, occasionally pressing his head against a trembling hand, or sitting close beside someone who had not spoken in a while. Thomas watched these small gestures and thought to himself that perhaps the dog understood the weight of nights like this better than men did. Then came the sound, a hard knock, sharp against the door, followed by another, louder, insistent. The wind nearly tore the door off its hinges when Thomas pulled it open, but through the snowstorm he saw a line of figures stumbling forward. 12 of them in total, silhouettes hunched beneath the fury of the storm. Their uniforms, though half buried under white frost, were unmistakable. Soldiers. The one in front stepped in first, nearly collapsing against the doorframe. He pulled down his hood, revealing Sergeant Daniel Cole, a man in his late 30s with shoulders still squared despite exhaustion. His face was chiseled, sharp cheekbones, a jaw dusted with 2 days of stubble, and gray eyes that carried a tired steadiness, the kind that came from too many years giving orders in crises. A streak of premature white ran through his short, dark hair, the mark of stress rather than age. His voice was hoarse when he spoke. "We're with the 42nd Brigade. Convoy's dead about 5 miles back. Engines froze, radios silent. We followed the sign." He swayed slightly, clutching the frame, but Thomas caught his arm, steadying him with a grip that betrayed his own soldier's strength. Behind him, the others filed in, each carrying the storm on their backs. Private First Class Anthony Rivera was the youngest, barely 20, slim with olive skin and dark curls plastered to his forehead, his wide brown eyes darting anxiously around the room. He moved with the restless energy of someone still trying to prove himself, but his lips quivered from cold and fear. Corporal Henry O'Donnell, by contrast, was a broad-shouldered Irish-American in his late 20s, thick red beard rimed with frost, freckles nearly lost beneath the pallor of his skin. His expression was grim, as if resignation had settled in his bones long ago. Life had been hard before the Army. Growing up poor in Pittsburgh, father gone early, mother working 3 jobs, and Henry wore survival like armor, silent but heavy. Among the group was also Specialist Sarah Thompson, one of only 2 women in the unit. She was tall, nearly 6 feet, her frame lean but muscular beneath the layers of snow-soaked fatigues. Her blonde hair, braided tight against her scalp, peaked. Beneath her knit cap and her face, angular, pale, with sharp gray-green eyes, spoke of determination bordering on defiance. She had grown up on a farm in Nebraska, used to hardship, and carried herself with the quiet resolve of someone who would not crumble even when others faltered. There were others. Their names murmured quickly as they shook off snow. Jenkins, Wu, Morales, and a few more. They were younger, mostly in their 20s, each bearing different expressions of fatigue, some shaking violently, others moving as if on instinct alone. Thomas did not waste time with questions. "Back there," he barked, pointing toward the cafe's kitchen where the stove gave off the most heat. "Drop the wet gear, sit and breathe before your lungs freeze." His tone was gruff, commanding in a way that cut through the haze of panic. The soldiers obeyed without hesitation, recognizing the authority of a man who had seen what they had seen. Ranger trotted ahead, circling the group, sniffing each one as though inspecting recruits. Finally, the dog pressed against Rivera's leg, sensing the young man's trembling. Rivera exhaled shakily, crouching to run his fingers through the dog's thick coat. For the first time since stepping in, his face softened. Thomas busied himself handing out towels, blankets, mugs of hot coffee. Earl Johnson, the trucker from earlier, joined in, his booming voice cutting the silence as he directed the placement of chairs, making space for the soldiers. Caleb, the wiry drifter, lingered by the stove, watching them with suspicion, though his gaze often wandered back to Sergeant Cole with something like respect. It was Sarah who noticed the photograph first. She was seated near the counter, her fingers curled around a mug of chili, when her eyes lifted to the wall behind Thomas. The framed portrait of a young man in uniform stared back, a smile frozen in time. "Who's that?" she asked softly, her voice carrying a gentleness unusual for a soldier. Thomas's hand stilled as he ladled soup. His gaze flickered toward the photo. "My brother, Michael Miller, Afghanistan. He didn't come home." The room grew quiet. Even the wind outside seemed to hush for a moment. Sergeant Cole's gray eyes lingered on the picture, his jaw tightening. "What unit?" he asked. 101st Fire Base Ripcord," Thomas answered, his voice flat but tinged with memory. Cole nodded slowly. "My father was there too. Different rotation, but same ground." His words carried weight, a thread between generations, binding the room together. One by one, stories began to surface, not loudly, not with bravado, but in fragments spoken into the flickering shadows of the kerosene lamp. Rivera whispered about his fear of not living up to his father, a police officer killed in the line of duty. O'Donnell muttered about the mines he had worked before enlisting, how the army had seemed easier than starvation. Sarah, her voice steady, spoke of nights on the farm when storms would flatten the fields, and her father's hands would be raw from pulling cattle back from frozen ditches. "You learn quick," she said simply, "that survival's not about you. It's about the ones standing next to you." Thomas listened, leaning against the counter, his arms crossed, his eyes fixed on Ranger sprawled contentedly among the soldiers. Inside him, old wounds stirred. The desert nights, the voices of men now buried, the face of his brother fading behind dust and gunfire. But there was also something new, a flicker of belonging, as if the cafe had become a barracks, a place where soldiers of different times shared the same burden. By 2 in the morning, The storm outside had grown monstrous, rattling the glass until it seemed the windows might shatter. Inside, however, warmth pulsed. The soldiers, civilians, and strangers formed a strange brotherhood, knitted together by necessity. Ranger moved from group to group, resting his head on knees, curling against the coldest among them. Thomas stood near the door, watching the snow pile higher against the glass, his hand absently stroking the scar on Ranger's flank. "They'll hold," he muttered to himself, though whether he meant the windows or the people, even he could not be sure. For tonight, Miller's Stop Cafe was no longer just a diner. It was a garrison, a sanctuary carved against the storm, held together by the stubborn heart of a veteran and the quiet, unspoken loyalty of a dog. The storm had not relented. If anything, it pressed harder against the city, wrapping Cleveland in a suffocating shroud of white. From the cafe windows, the outside world looked like a void, snow rushing in all directions, the night sky indistinguishable from the earth. Inside Miller's Stop Cafe, the small space that had once been just a roadside coffee shop was now transformed into something else entirely. It had become a makeshift garrison of survival, crowded with soldiers, truckers, drifters, and now, slowly, townsfolk who had heard whispers that warmth still flickered here. Word traveled through trucker radios, through neighbors banging on doors, through sheer luck. One by one, people staggered in, faces raw from the cold, clothes crusted with ice. The cafe filled beyond capacity. Thomas Miller, though weary, did not waver. He stacked pallets salvaged from the back storage room, laying down cardboard and old blankets to make temporary beds. The stove hissed and coughed, struggling against the endless cold, but Thomas moved with the unhurried steadiness of a soldier on duty. Ranger patrolled constantly, weaving between bodies, pressing his warm weight against whoever shivered most, barking softly when panic threatened to spread. The newcomers were varied, each with their own shadow of the storm. Margaret Hensley, a widowed schoolteacher in her early 60s, arrived wrapped in a wool coat too thin for the weather. She was tall and narrow, her face framed by wiry gray hair that had escaped from a loose bun. Years of teaching had given her a sharp voice and a habit of commanding attention without raising her volume. Though her hands shook as she entered, once she steadied herself, she immediately began organizing children who clung to their parents, soothing them with the same calm she had once used in classrooms. Then came Darrell Simmons, a mechanic in his mid-40s, with grease permanently embedded in the cracks of his skin. His build was stocky, his shoulders wide from years of hoisting engines, his beard dark and patchy. A limp slowed his stride, the result of a car accident years ago that had left him distrustful of fate. Cynical by nature, he grumbled at the storm, at the cold, at the very act of being alive that night. But when Thomas handed him tools to help secure tarps over the windows, Darrell's hands steadied, his focus sharpening. Work, after all, was his way of silencing fear. A young mother named Elena Brooks came next, barely 30, with pale skin flushed pink from cold and long auburn hair plastered to her cheeks by melting snow. She carried a boy of 5 years old, Peter, who clutched a stuffed rabbit so worn its ears flopped like rags. Elena's eyes were wide, frantic, yet fiercely protective. Her husband had been stranded at work on the far side of town, leaving her alone to guard her child. Her body trembled, but when Ranger pressed close to Peter and the boy giggled despite his tears, Elena's shoulders loosened for the first time. Soon the warehouse space behind the cafe was filled with voices, the kind of low murmur that rises when too many people crowd together, half in fear, half in reluctant comfort. The soldiers of the 42nd Brigade took on tasks without orders. Sarah Thompson hauled firewood. Henry O'Donnell adjusted broken window frames. Rivera passed out mugs of hot water. Sergeant Cole walked the rows like a quiet commander, checking pulses, making sure no one drifted into dangerous sleep. It was near 2 a.m. when disaster struck. From above the kitchen came a sharp crack, followed by a roar of water. A pipe had burst in the ceiling, spraying icy torrents across the floor. Within moments, puddles spread across the concrete, threatening to freeze. The already uneasy crowd erupted, shouts, panic, parents clutching children. A few prepared to bolt into the storm itself, irrational but desperate. Thomas, chest heaving from exhaustion, climbed onto a wooden crate near the center of the room. His voice, gravelly and commanding, sliced through the noise. "Listen," he shouted, the single word booming with the force of battlefield memory. The room stilled, eyes snapping to him. He stood tall, silhouetted against the kerosene light, his hand resting on Ranger's head. "No one leaves. Not tonight. We don't abandon each other in the storm. Not here, not ever. You understand me? We will patch the leak, we will dry what we can, and we will make it until morning." His voice was steel, forged in deserts and loss, unyielding. Ranger barked once, sharp and certain, as if punctuating the command. People froze, then slowly began to nod. Cole gave a clipped order, soldiers moved, and within minutes Darrell was crawling on his bad leg toward the valve, wrench in hand, shutting off the water with practiced skill. Blankets and rags were pressed into the flood. Margaret corralled frightened children, singing softly to distract them. Elena clutched Peter, whispering that they were safe, eyes locked on Thomas as if his calm alone held the walls intact. When the chaos dimmed, Thomas stepped down, his boots splashing in shallow water, his mind heavy with both relief and exhaustion. Inside, he felt his brother Michael's voice again, the one that never left him. "Hold them steady, Tommy. You were always the strong one." He rubbed his beard, staring at the huddled crowd, realizing that in this moment he had become the anchor he never believed he could be. Hours dragged on. The storm battered the building, but inside, life pulsed stubbornly. Some whispered stories of summers past, of families now far away, of meals shared when food had not been scarce. Margaret recited a verse of poetry to lull children to sleep. Darrell, grumbling less now, fixed a loose hinge on the stove door with a mechanic's pride. Elena dozed in a chair, her son curled against Ranger's flank, the boy's small hand buried in the dog's fur. By dawn, the snow outside had swallowed cars and half-buried streetlights. Inside, however, Miller's Stop Cafe stood intact, not just as a building, but as a fragile bastion of willpower. No one had left. No one had been lost. For Thomas, that meant something larger than survival. It meant he had kept his vow. And as the weak light of morning crept through frost-covered windows, Ranger lifted his head, ears pricked, as if reminding them all that the night had been endured not through luck, but through resolve. By dawn, the storm was still raging but weaker, its roar broken into harsh breaths of wind, as if even the blizzard had grown tired. The snowbanks stood waist-high along the roads, and every parked car was just a lump beneath a white burial shroud. Inside Miller's Stop Cafe, people were waking in shifts, rubbing their eyes, stiff from sleeping on pallets, sipping lukewarm coffee from whatever mugs and jars Thomas could find. Ranger sat by the door as always, his ears twitching at every sound beyond the glass, his black and tan coat rising and falling with slow breaths. Then came a new sound, the deep rumble of engines, steady, organized, deliberate. The ground trembled slightly under their weight. Thomas's hand froze halfway to his coffee mug, his soldier's instincts snapping awake. He glanced at Sergeant Cole, who was already on his feet, gray eyes narrowed. "That's no trucker convoy," Cole muttered. Moments later, the first Humvee appeared through the curtains of snow, its camouflage paint flecked white with frost, followed by 3 more in perfect formation. Behind them rolled 2 larger trucks with tarpaulin covers, their heavy tires grinding through the slush with authority. The convoy stopped outside the cafe, engines idling like beasts waiting for command. Doors opened. Boots struck the snow in unison. The man who stepped down first was unmistakably in charge. Colonel Richard Hayes was in his late 50s, tall, broad-shouldered, his posture ramrod straight despite the cold. His buzzed gray hair was speckled with white, his square jaw marked by the faint shadow of an old scar running from ear to chin, the kind of scar that told stories no one wanted to ask about. His face was weathered, like stone beaten by wind and sun, and his pale eyes behind steel-rimmed glasses gave the impression of a man who missed nothing. He wore his authority as naturally as his heavy officer's coat, and his voice, when it came, was a bark that silenced the room. He entered without asking permission, his boots thudding on the cafe floor. "Who's in charge here?" he demanded, his gaze sweeping over civilians, soldiers, and even Ranger. Thomas stepped forward, shoulders squared, meeting Hayes's eyes without flinching. "That would be me," he said evenly. For a moment the room seemed suspended in silence, every breath held. Hayes studied him, taking in the tired braid of gray in Thomas's beard, the red rims of his eyes, the stubborn stance. "What is this?" Hayes asked, gesturing toward the warehouse behind. "Some kind of civilian shelter? You're housing over 30 civilians, my soldiers, and that animal in a storage room, and you're telling me it's been peaceful." Thomas's answer was steady. "We've had frozen pipes, panic, and near exhaustion. But no one's been lost. Not one." Hayes's mouth tightened, skeptical, but he pressed no further. His eyes shifted to the wall above the counter. There, framed in a wooden border, was the photograph of Michael Miller. Hayes froze, his jaw tightening, his hand rising almost involuntarily to brush over the scar on his chin. "What unit?" he asked quietly. Thomas's voice dropped. 101st Firebase Ripcord, Afghanistan." Hayes inhaled slowly, the sound almost a sigh. "I knew that name," he murmured. "Michael Miller. He was my radio operator. He saved my life more than once out there." The room fell utterly silent, all eyes on them. Thomas's throat constricted, his brother's name on the lips of another man bringing memories back like gunfire echoing through the years. Hayes removed his glasses, rubbing his eyes briefly, then replaced them. His composure regained, but softened. He reached into his coat and pulled out a government-issued envelope, thick with crisp bills. "For services rendered," he said, extending it. Thomas shook his head. "I'm not taking your money." His voice was firm, final. "This isn't charity. It's duty. The same as his, the same as yours." For the first time since entering, Hayes's face shifted. Less commander and more man. He slowly withdrew the envelope. "All right," he said. "What if we strike a deal?" Behind him, another officer stepped forward. Major Ellen Whitaker, a woman in her mid-40s, stood at attention. She was of medium height, with cropped black hair streaked with silver, and a face cut sharp by discipline. Her dark eyes carried the piercing look of someone who had spent a career inspecting barracks and supply lines. "Sir," she said quietly, "we could establish a depot here. It's structurally sound enough with reinforcement. Civilians can be stabilized while we operate from this point." Hayes nodded, turning back to Thomas. "We'll bring in fuel, real beds, medical supplies, engineers to fix the roof. In exchange, you let us use this warehouse as a temporary supply hub until the storm passes. No one here will freeze again." Thomas hesitated, his mind flickering between pride and exhaustion. He glanced at Ranger, who was sitting tall by his side, amber eyes steady, then at the tired faces of Margaret, Elena, Caleb, Earl, and the soldiers now watching him as though his decision mattered more than the storm itself. He extended his hand. "Deal." The handshake was firm, sealing something larger than survival. Within hours, Army engineers moved in. Lieutenant Mark Dwyer, a wiry man in his 30s with sandy hair, freckles, and an easy grin, directed men with toolkits to patch the shattered roof panels. Dwyer was known among his peers as a problem solver, always the one to fix a jammed weapon or an overheated engine, and here his enthusiasm spread quickly. Fuel barrels were rolled in. Medics unpacked crates of gauze and antibiotics. Civilians and soldiers worked side by side, unloading supplies, reinforcing insulation with sheets of plywood. The transformation was swift. By afternoon, the warehouse glowed with heat, lamps, cots lined in rows, steaming pots of rations bubbling on portable stoves. Margaret Hensley organized a reading corner for children with donated blankets, calming their restless spirits. Darrell Simmons, the mechanic, lent his hands to the Army engineers, cursing under his breath, but secretly invigorated by the work. Elena Brooks helped distribute food, while her son Peter rode happily on Ranger's back, the dog tolerating the boys' laughter with patient dignity. By nightfall, Miller's Stop Cafe was no longer a desperate refuge. It was a command center, a sanctuary, and a symbol. Thomas stood by the doorway, arms crossed, watching as civilians and soldiers shared tables, as truckers played cards with privates, as Sarah Thompson sat by the stove, teaching Peter how to tie knots in a piece of string. Sergeant Cole leaned beside him, murmuring, "You did this." Thomas shook his head, eyes drifting toward Michael's photo. "He did. I just kept the doors open." From across the room, Hayes watched silently. His expression, though as stern as ever, carried the faintest trace of respect. In the fragile warmth of that night, the storm beyond their walls no longer felt invincible. By the next morning, Miller's Stop Cafe no longer resembled the battered roadside diner it had been only 2 days ago. The storm had turned it into a crucible, and out of that crucible came something new. Soldiers in camouflage and civilians in mismatched coats worked side by side, hauling crates, fixing leaks, hammering plywood into place. The once cracked roof now gleamed under a fresh panel of reinforced steel. The flickering stove was supplemented by military-grade heaters, and cots stretched in neat lines where pallets and cardboard had been just hours before. Ranger, the German shepherd, ran tirelessly through it all, his thick paws skidding slightly on the wet floor, tail slicing the air with confidence. At 7 years old, his muzzle gray with age, he moved like a commander in his own right, checking on each cluster of people, nudging the weary curling beside the frightened. To the children, he was a guardian angel in fur. To the soldiers, he was a reminder of home, of barracks where dogs patrolled like brothers in arms. And to Thomas, he was the bridge between past and present, between what was lost and what was still possible. Colonel Richard Hayes had set up his command post in the corner of the cafe, a map of the county spread across two tables pushed together. His posture remained rigid, but those who watched closely could see the way his eyes softened each time he glanced at Michael Miller's photo. He had been forged by decades of command, his scarred jaw and storm-gray gaze intimidating. Yet when he spoke to the children, his voice dipped, gravel smoothing into something almost gentle. Major Ellen Whitaker proved indispensable, directing supply distribution with sharp gestures and quick decisions. Her dark eyes missed nothing, and her cropped black and silver hair gave her a stern air, though she occasionally crouched to help Peter Brooks tie his shoes or praised Margaret Hensley for organizing the children's lessons. Lieutenant Mark Dwyer, freckles bright against his pale skin, darted around fixing broken latches, sealing drafty cracks. His hands always smudged with grease, but his smile disarming even the most cynical. As the day stretched on, Thomas found himself caught in the center of it all. He moved from table to table, answering questions, steadying nerves, and yet each time someone thanked him, he shook his head. "It's not me," he muttered. "It's this place. It's what it was meant to be." Still, the eyes that turned toward him saw not just a man, but a leader who had risen when the storm demanded it. That night, as lanterns glowed in every corner and the storm outside weakened into scattered flakes, Colonel Hayes called for silence. Soldiers and civilians alike gathered in the warehouse, sitting on cots, chairs, even the floor. The air smelled of soup and wood smoke, but the mood was reverent, as though something sacred was about to happen. Hayes stepped to the front, a small wooden box in his hand. His scarred face seemed harder than usual, but his voice, when he spoke, carried an unshakable sincerity. "Years ago," Hayes began, "there was a man named Michael Miller. He was my radio operator in Afghanistan. He saved lives. My life more than once. He was recommended for a medal, but paperwork was lost. Bureaucracy buried it, and the recognition never came." He paused, glancing at the photo on the wall, his throat tight. "Tonight, after what I've seen here, it's time that wrong was made right." He opened the box. Inside lay a bronze star medal, its surface gleaming in the lantern light. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Hayes stepped forward and placed it in Thomas's hands. "For Michael Miller," he said, his voice rough, "and for the legacy you have carried forward here, against this storm." Thomas stared at the medal, his calloused fingers trembling as they closed around it. His blue eyes shone with tears he refused to let fall. Around him, silence reigned until Sarah Thompson, tall and resolute, rose to her feet and saluted sharply. Sergeant Cole followed, then O'Donnell, Rivera, Dwyer, Whitaker. The soldiers' salute spread to the civilians, truckers pressing their hands over their hearts. Margaret standing tall as if before a classroom, Elena clutching Peter as the boy raised his small hand. Even Caleb, the wary drifter, straightened and gave a stiff nod, something like respect softening his sharp features. And then Ranger barked, one deep, resonant sound that seemed to vibrate through the floor, commanding attention like a trumpet blast. The crowd stirred, some smiling through tears, others standing straighter as if that bark itself was a call to duty. Thomas lowered his head, overcome, while Hayes stood beside him, his own jaw clenched against emotion. When the storm finally broke the next morning, the world outside was transformed. The sky was pale blue, the air sharp and clean, sunlight striking off the endless drifts of snow like fire on glass. Soldiers shoveled out the road while children played in the fresh powder. By midday, a small team of engineers erected a plaque at the cafe's entrance, bolting it firmly into the frozen ground beside the old flagpole. The bronze plate gleamed with fresh engraving. Miller's Stop, where no one is left behind in winter. Thomas stood before it, the metal heavy in his pocket, Ranger pressed against his leg. He thought of his brother Michael, of the storm, of the strangers who had become something like family within these walls. He realized then that Miller's Stop was no longer just a cafe, nor even just a shelter. It was a legacy written in snow and survival, guarded by a loyal dog and carried by those who refused to turn anyone away. Even in life's coldest storms, God sends us small miracles, sometimes through a loyal dog, a caring hand, or a stranger's kindness. May we each become a light for someone in need. If this story touched your heart, please share, comment, and subscribe, and may God bless you always.